go from the top again.
Yeah.
Yeah, just give me a self-intro and a quick overview.
Yeah. I'm Peter Fiekowsky. I'm the founder of the Foundation for Climate Restoration and the author of Climate Restoration, the only future that will sustain the human race.
Just go in a little bit of detail about what climate restoration is, 101.
Climate restoration is fundamentally the goal of restoring the climate to give our children a climate that humans have actually survived long term. And it also includes then the methods that can achieve that.
And what's the baseline? When you say restoring the climate, what would you compare that to?
The baseline climate is the climate we had over the last 10 or 12,000 years, during which we developed agriculture and our civilization. And that's the climate that we know humans will survive with no uncertainty.
And just talk us through what changed that.
So over the last over the last 250 years, we've been burning a lot of coal and other fossil fuels, and our population has gone up by a factor of 10. Let me turn off my phone, and we'll do that again.
Oh, sure.
What was that last question?
Yeah, I think just talk about, let's just do this again. Talk about the baseline of what a good atmosphere is and how that changed, what caused that to happen.
The baseline for climate restoration is the CO2 levels that we had over the last 12,000 years, during which we developed agriculture and civilization. Then around the beginning of the industrial age, around 1750, both our population started exploding and our emissions correspondingly started exploding with the use of coal and other fossil fuels. So at this point, CO2 levels are 50% higher than humans have ever survived long term. And most of us consider that a very bad omen for our progeny.
So before we get into climate restoration a bit more, just talk about the misnomer around, net zero, and most people believe that, well, if we just reduce emissions, we might be okay.
Yeah, early on in the 1960s and 70s, if we had simply stopped driving our cars and heating our houses, we would have stopped emitting CO2, and CO2 levels would have been stayed in the safe level that humans have survived. But that ship really left about 50 years ago, and by 30 years ago, in 1988, CO2 levels exceeded the 350 parts per million, which is the accepted maximum that humans are likely to survive, that would sustain the ecosystems that we've grown up with. So stopping emissions now would leave CO2 levels at something that we're unlikely to survive.
Okay. So
you can take this out, but I read an article today about fossils, or I read an article today about DNA that was found in the Arctic from 2 million years ago, when CO2 was almost as high as it is now, and they had forget it. Too many details. I don't remember. Forget it. Read about it, and then just today they reported that they found the DNA from the kinds of animals that you find in temperate levels now. But anyway, never mind.
So we're talking about the fact that people are under the illusion that just reducing is going to help, but it's not, right?
Yeah, I always ask the question, have you ever heard an expert claim that if we got to net zero by 2050, which is the common goal promoted by the United Nations, that there would be a good chance that humanity as we know it would survive? And the answer is always no. I've never heard an expert say that. And there's good reason experts don't say that.
Give me where you think we're at now in the journey of climate restoration.
Well, where we're at now is more and more people are getting interested in climate restoration. We're realizing that the future of our children and our grandchildren and great-grandchildren is at stake. And we're realizing that the current policies aren't addressing that issue. And the biggest turning point, as normal people understand that, is getting the scientific community to start extrapolating what would happen if we actually restored the climate, because it's never happened in the past, and so the scientific community cannot say that it has anything more than almost zero probability of happening in the future. So we need to leave some evidence that we're actually going to do that, and that's really the biggest turning point for the next year or two.
Where do you think we're at now in terms of scientists buying into it? Just an overview.
Scientists are getting very interested in doing the research which can show that it's possible. And so that's beginning to happen. Yet when asked, most scientists will say that it's never happened before, and politically it doesn't look like it will happen.
But you feel that is changing?
Yeah, the scientific community is very wise, and they're constrained by the scientific literature. So as more literature is written about the methods to restore the climate, then they'll be more willing to discuss it.
What do you think our chances are of succeeding with climate restoration, both scientifically and in terms of policy and will? And can you answer that as a statement, because my question won't be on that?
Yeah, I'm totally optimistic that we'll restore the climate. There are multiple redundant methods of doing it at this point, and they're all financially viable. Most of them are proven safe by nature, and most of us getting involved in this have devoted our lives to it, because I like to tell people, what else am I going to do other than restore the climate for the survival of our species?
Is this a truism that the thing that's holding scientists back in most cases is taking it to scale because the variables increase in scale?
Ask that question again.
It seems to me, with my limited scientific understanding, that the thing that affects all of these different areas of scientists giving blanket buy-in is taking it to scale, because with the ocean, just the number of variables like the weather increase, and they say well, in this area it could be this and that could create that and whatever. So would you say that the biggest obstacle in terms of scientific research is just having the resources to take experiments to scale?
Well, I'll give a nasty comment and then we can turn it into a nice comment. The Earth is a very complex system. The ocean is where most of the carbon dioxide removal is going to happen, and the ocean is constantly changing with weather and currents and temperatures and whales and other species moving from one place to another. And so the research that scientists do about what will happen in a certain area at a certain time is very good. It produces a good paper, but it doesn't tell us very much about what will happen in a different position or that same position a year later. So the issue is not the scientific research. The issue is getting involved and doing it. The climate restoration is an engineering project. Just like building a house, you never know what problems you run into until you build the house. And then you solve the problems, unless you give up. And we're not going to give up. So the issues of getting CO2 back to safe levels is just a matter of solving the problems as we discover them.
Could you emphasize that, sorry, that's leading a question. I don't know. Can you just talk about the issue that people have concerns around in terms of restoration just acting in and of itself, that It can't be a free ticket. It has to work in concert with other things.
Well, the biggest issue people have with restoration is that it's not the collective goal. So the United Nations has put together the United Nations has put together the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and they've said that our goal is to reduce the worst aspects of climate change. Now, that doesn't call for the survival of humanity. And so people are reluctant to go against conventional thinking. Yeah.
But even when in fact, at COP27, somebody else was giving a talk, and somebody on the panel responded saying, and all this stuff about restoration, which all it's going to do is give a free ticket to the fossil fuel industry, and we can't have that. And so this person obviously had a limited understanding of what it was about, and they'd already 100% developed an opinion about it.
Yeah.
How do we get around that?
Well, climate has become a political issue. It became a political issue in the early 80s when we decided it was really a financial issue more than a scientific issue. And it became left versus right and accusation versus accusation. And so many people think that we have to punish the oil companies. And I'm not a fan or an unfan of the oil companies, but they're doing business, and most of us buy their products.
The opinion's been expressed to me by numerous people that pushing for climate restoration is just letting the oil companies off the hook.
Yeah, a lot of people say that climate restoration would let the oil companies off the hook. And there's a certain sense in which that's true. That is to say, the oil companies have persisted for 50 years of opposition, and they will probably continue for a long time, and presumably will restore the climate at that time. So it's very true. On the other hand, is it true that if we destroyed the oil companies, that would improve the climate? And there's no evidence for that. No one claims that if we destroyed the oil companies, the climate would get better. There's no reason to think that.
But you do support the idea, the notion that they need to kind of do whatever they can to reduce what they're doing.
The oil companies, just like everyone who uses oil, I have a gas car still, and we do everything we can to reduce how much we burn and how many emissions we put out. The oil companies are working hard to do that, and they will continue to work hard to do that as prices and carbon pricing increases.
What's going to make sorry, I'm just going to start again. Can you talk about forming F4CR and the value of that?
Early on, we created the Foundation for Climate Restoration, which was working primarily with the United Nations and to some degree with the U.S. government. And the purpose was, it was a very idealistic goal to get the United Nations to call for restoring the climate. At the time, we didn't realize how naive we were, that they couldn't do that on their own, that they needed to get youth and faith leaders and even industrialists to call for it. So we've, to a large degree, set aside the UN goals. They'll come when they, well, that's a long story. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, cool. Sorry, let me just start that file again.
So the Foundation for Climate Restoration now is working primarily on curriculum for schools, primary, secondary, and college, as well as advocacy for laws and for bills that will promote the businesses that can get the massive amounts of carbon out of the atmosphere.
What's the presentation to kids, broad brushstroke? What are they taught?
Actually, I don't know. They haven't shown me their curriculum.
Oh, okay.
But
I'll get it off.
Yeah.
I'll ask for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Okay, the next question is...
The main goal of the kids' curriculum is to have them learn to expect that we're going to restore the climate. Expectations are critical, and parents are very prone to their children's expectations. So in addition to the technology of how is it done, it's very important that kids understand that it's up to them to make sure that their children can survive on our planet.
Can we talk about, it's quite important to you in terms of communicating and how you express things like climate restoration and how you express the positive aspect of it. A lot of people in their dialogue, even probably on a subconscious level, are kind of just loaded with negative energy in the way they express themselves. Got no idea what the question is, but can you kind of talk about, you know, the implicit and the explicit and what's important to you in terms of messaging?
Yeah. What I find over the years is that people are very resigned about the climate. The fact that people ask, if we restore the climate, does that just let the oil companies off the hook, points to the fact that people have given up on giving their children a climate that humans will survive. And all they want to do is do the right thing in the meantime. The first thing I tell people is that to look at your own resignation, that have you given up on the fact that, have you given up on giving our children, your children, my children, a planet that they can flourish on? Once you notice that, once people notice they've given up, they quickly say, okay, I'm going to pick up the ball and we'll restore the climate now.
You think a lot of people don't even realize they've given up. They just kind of been subconsciously... Oh, sorry, I'm going to... Yeah, do you think a lot of people have kind of subconsciously given up? They just don't realize that they're so negative.
I think almost everybody, I think everybody has given up. I had certainly given up and thought that the best I could do is try. I was talking to a scientist last week, and he said, well, we'll do the best we can and we'll get what we get. And I think that's a very common approach. And I'm hoping to break through his resignation, although it's been about 4 years so far.
Wouldn't it be horrible if your doctor spoke like that?
It would be horrible if your doctor said, well, do the best you can.
Let's talk about the end game. We're based on where we're at, the trajectory that we're on, that you're on. Where do you see us in 10 years, and then where do you see us around about 2050?
Well, we've gamed out the process, and within the next 2 years, we're expecting to get the required $2 billion a year to do the CO2 removal and the methane removal. And by the end of this decade, we're expecting that the CO2 removal will be scaled at such a level that by 2050 will be scaled at such a level that by 2050 we'll be back at safe levels below 300. And it looks like we can also oxidize methane to the point that by the end of this decade, by far the worst aspects of global warming will have gone away and will be away from the massive hurricanes and massive wildfires. There's no guarantee of that, but the data points that way.
Can you just emphasize what would be the biggest impediment to success? And I'm just getting at kind of behavioral or thinking as opposed to the science. So what do you think would be the biggest obstacle that would stand in the way of restoration achieving its goal?
Well, the biggest obstacle to restoration achieving the goal would be somehow if there was a religious call to let it go, just stopping. You know, the story about failure is you only fail when you stop trying. And most of us are not going to stop trying. So I don't see any reason that we're not going to succeed.
That's great. I think combined with what I've already...
I'll edit it.
So when you say one of the tenets of climate restoration, but certainly one of the tenets of your approach to sharing climate restoration or supporting it is what you're saying.
One of the fundamentals of climate restoration is that there are no enemies on this path. Although climate has been political since the 1980s, in fact, every single one of us that I've talked to, and that's thousands, wants to leave a climate that our climate for our children that humans have actually survived, that we know they'll survive in. And the people who are doing it in a way different than what you think, they're looking at the best way they know. My parents were both economists, and the way that they knew to deal with climate was through the economics. And in the Reagan administration, that was the approach that was taken, is let's get the economy going, and that will improve things. It turned out not to work very well, but that was the best tool they had. So we bring everybody along on climate restoration. I understand from left to right what motivates people, and I welcome everybody in.
Cool. Yeah. That kind of responds to what I was